Welcome to Baha'i Books and Authors, a podcast which introduces to you writers and the works they've penned related to the Baha'i faith. We'll explore the inspiration, the process, and the stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jan Grammer. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media, which also produces Baha'i audiobooks. Throughout history, people have longed for peace on earth, yet conflict and war persist. Many hold as truth that aggression is intrinsic to human nature. We'll always have it and war, no matter what. Today's episode of Baha'i Books and Authors focuses on a world without war, Abdu'l-Bahá and the discourse for global peace, which presents the Baha'i vision for a peaceful society founded on unity and justice. It challenges us to reconsider the notion that war is inevitable and explore how divine principles can transform our world. It details these principles elucidated by Abdu'l-Bahá, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Bahá'u'lláh. Let's explore the spiritual and practical insights this book offers, examining how these principles can guide us toward building a world defined and experienced as peaceful. I'm delighted to welcome co-authors Dr. Janet Khan and Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Janet, what were the reasons or the circumstances in the world which made you feel that this time in the 2020s was time for the book?
The starting point for our book were really two centenaries, two celebrations. The first was the 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War, the First World War, 1914-18. And during this time, scholars and historians were reflecting in quite a sensitive way about the causes of the war. It was supposed to have been a war that ended all wars, and yet the world is still confronted with conflict and wars that seem to be never ending. So that made us really interested in looking at this period in history. Another element were the very comprehensive and detailed letters on peace that Abdu'l-Bahá had addressed to a peace organization at The Hague. These letters were written just at the end of the First World War, and so we were celebrating then another centenary. So these two events, the centenary of the end of the war and the centenary of the publication of these two tablets, seemed a great opportunity to reflect deeply on the content of Abdu'l-Bahā's letters and consider their relevance to contemporary times and to the discourse on peace, and also to take another sensitive look at the Baha'i perspective on peace.
Hoda, what made you want to write this book, and in collaboration with Janet?
I'm the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, and when it became clear that the 100th anniversary of the Tablets of the Hague was coming up, I really wanted us to have this book published by its 100th anniversary. So that's when, about a year, I think, before, maybe a little more, Janet and I started thinking about the book and organizing our thoughts about the book, because we thought that that would be a wonderful anniversary for the Baha'i Chair to also celebrate, because obviously a chair that is meant to examine the teachings of the Baha'i faith in relation to world peace, what is more relevant and pertinent than to not only celebrate that anniversary of the 100 years since these tablets were revealed, but also, more importantly, to take into consideration how a program like the Baha'i Chair can bring the principles that are outlined in these wonderful tablets into reality by looking at them through the lens of academics and different disciplines, and then looking for solutions to peace.
Janet, The Hague has long been a symbol of international justice and peace, housing institutions like the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Please tell us more about that.
The Hague is a very interesting place. When we were writing the book, I became interested in The Hague and what was special about it. One of the historians whose work I looked at made the comment that The Hague had never been a walled city. Many of the European cities in the Middle Ages and whatever were walled, and this restricted contact and the flow of people. But because The Hague is on the coast, it's been accessible, if you will. It's been the place where people have come to sign treaties, to engage, to have conferences. So there was a greater freedom associated with its location. And this, I think, contributed to it being a venue chosen for conferences on peace. Now, I think its reputation as a centre for peace really dates to the holding of two international peace conferences, the first in 1899 and the second in 1907. And these were conferences that were convened by the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, for the purpose of really looking about how to control armaments, but also looking at the rules of war and the means for establishing peace.
As you said, Abdu'l-Bahá in late 1919 and mid-1920 sent 2 letters or tablets. These were to the Executive Committee of the Central Organization for a Durable Peace at The Hague, contributing his thoughts on universal peace. What were some of those contributions?
Before talking about the contributions, it's useful to know a little bit more about this organization that the letters were addressed to. The Central Organization for a Durable Peace at The Hague was really an outgrowth of the 2 conferences that had been held earlier on, 1899, 1907. Because of the positive expectation that was connected to these conferences about them developing into something, a 3rd peace conference had been tentatively planned. However, the war intervened in 1914 and the conference had to be postponed. Nevertheless, the Dutch peace movement and the Swiss, they weren't prepared to give up on it. And so they organized a body that would take care of peace business for a temporary period of time. So like during the war, they figured out after that it'd be possible to do something more enduring. The interesting thing about this body was that its stated purpose was not to actually figure out a way to end the 1914-1918 war, but its purpose was to identify what they described as principles that would underpin a sustainable, enduring peace once the 1914 war was concluded. So they developed a manifesto, they had a plan of action, and this was circulated really throughout the world, very much in Europe, but in other parts of the world, including in Iran. And so the information about the activities and the goals of the organization were reported about in a newspaper in Tehran. A very alert young Baha'i by the name of Ahmad Yazdani saw this notice in the newspaper, saw an opportunity to provide information about a Baha'i perspective, consulted with some of the other prominent Baha'is in the area, and they decided to write to the central organization, indicating that, since they were looking for ideas, here were some ideas, recommending that they might find it useful to correspond with Abdu'l-Bahá. So this was how the connection was made. And I think knowing what the goals of the organization were really has implications for Abdu'l-Bahā's response.
So, Hoda, what were some of those contributions or some of the thoughts of Abdu'l-Bahá?
We could take days, if not months, to talk about this, but I'll summarize. Just before I start to summarize, I want to say that I think in the future, historians will look back to these tablets as a very significant contribution to the model the perspective which Baha'u'lláh has given for how to achieve peace. And it's a very unique perspective. These tablets, right now, they're not valued as much as they should be. But I think in the future, they will mark the beginning of a very important period in history. In these tablets, Abdu'l-Bahá basically outlines the complexity of achieving world peace. He begins by saying to this committee that there's not a soul on the planet, when you ask them, who would say that they don't want peace. And then he begins to talk about what this peace means. And he said the way that we have to raise awareness about peace is to raise human conscience. In other words, until you get the minds of individuals to unify around an idea, you're not going to accomplish anything. So this concept of unity, which permeates the Baha'i teachings, becomes extremely important, Abdu'l-Bahá conveys in his letters, to the establishment of peace. And then he says, but the kind of peace that Baha'u'lláh is speaking of, and now I'm paraphrasing, is an integrative, a holistic kind of peace, which is inclusive of the entire humankind. So it's not just about ending wars. It's not just about getting rid of weapons of destruction. It's about how do you remove the barriers to peace so that all of humanity can enjoy material and spiritual civilization. And then he begins by literally paragraph by paragraph going through the principles of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Just by way of example, one of the major sources of conflict in this world are prejudices. Prejudices of religion, of economics, patriotic prejudice, political prejudice, and that until we begin to understand how to eliminate these various kinds of prejudices, there won't be a peaceful world. He talks about the equality of women and how that is an important principle in relation to getting rid of wars and bringing about peace, that until half of humanity, in fact, this is the paragraph where he compares humanity to the bird and the wings to man and woman. And oftentimes some people focus on the wings, but really it's the body of the bird that one should focus on, because humanity cannot fly, cannot soar, cannot advance if that body of the bird is not flying sufficiently, properly. And it takes both wings in unison to bring that about. So he really emphasizes this principle of the equality of women and men. Anyway, he goes through all the principles and says that these are the means by which we can advance humanity towards world peace. A peace, like I explained, is around the concept of the oneness of humanity, but I refer to it as integrative because most theories of peace really look at it, well, if we could just bring about better consultative methods, we would achieve peace. If we could get rid of weapons of war, we would do a better job at getting to peace. But I think what Abdu'l-Bahá does in these tablets is he combines spiritual principles with material civilization and then says, until you have balanced these and until you have achieved these, it will not be possible. Finally, I just want to say this is so significant. He said, but really peace begins with the individual. And that I think is extremely significant. Every one of us, each individual has to take responsibility for creating a culture of peace. It begins with the individual and then it goes into the world. It goes into the neighborhood, into institutions, into the political realm, etc.
How do you see his teachings challenge conventional political and economic models of peacekeeping?
You know, again, the emphasis that he puts at the very beginning of the first tablet on until individuals have unity of mind about any matter, about any issue, until you have unity of mind, you can't solve that issue. You can't resolve that problem. This is something that I think in today's world, which is so fragmented and so filled with, what shall I say, antagonism, it's something that really needs to be talked about and exercised more frequently, because people basically go after social problems Okay, they go after causes, if you will, and they think that they need to take them on one at a time. And of course, it's exhausting, as we see. I'm not just talking about one country, I'm talking about all the countries. And this is where the Baha'i principle and what Abdu'l-Bahá says in these tablets, that whether you're talking about a problem in a family, in the neighborhood, at your work, or among politicians, whatever it is you're trying to resolve, you need to decide on the principles of how to resolve that problem first. What are the issues? What are the principles that should be applied? And then create some kind of unity of thought within the family, within the workplace, within the neighborhood, among politicians, and then you will see results. But to simply go after one problem and another in sequence brings about such chaos and fragmentation, and actually, unfortunately, it pits one group of people against another. And we keep going in circles in relation to this pattern. We repeat wars. We repeat one group of people opposing another group of people on the streets, demonstrating, whatever the situation. So I think how Abdu'l-Bahá informs today's world and today's political world is to say the leaders of the world have a responsibility to the people they govern. But the leaders of a world in an interdependent world, in a world that is so closely knit together and interconnected, need to come together and decide, can we become a unified group of nations who collaborate on the limited resources on this planet and figure out how to help each other so that everyone thrives, everyone prospers? Or do we just continue with the old model, which keeps repeating and going in circles with more wars, whether it's economic wars, whether it's literal wars, whatever kind of war? So this notion of unity of the minds of people that Abdu'l-Bahá put forth, it is so critical to, I would say, just about every problem that we face in the world today at any level. As I said, within the family, in our educational system, in our neighborhoods, in our countries, on and on and on.
We're looking for ways forward, both on the world stage and also for individuals to play a part. What would you like the readers of your book to take away that they can implement in their lives?
Again, as I said, the most important thing is to first look at oneself. It's always easy to criticize others, and it's always easy to take it out on others. But I think really we need to look at ourselves and to start with how each of us can do things through our actions in order to promote these principles that are outlined in the Tablets to the Hague. I think without that self-reflection and without internalizing those principles, it's impossible to bring change. Social change comes about because human beings change, and they take that change into the world. And I think when it comes to achieving peace, I don't want to make it sound easy because I think it's a very difficult process. I think it's something that acquires enormous concentration and enormous discipline, constantly bringing oneself to account. Am I doing what I can do in order to remove the barriers to peace in my community, in my workplace, in whatever space I find myself in? So to me, that was the lesson from this book that is so important. And of course, Abdu'l-Bahá's basic guidance that unify the minds of individuals, bring unity about around the problems, and then solve the problems.
Janet, what would you like your readers to glean and be able to apply to their own lives?
Like Hoda, I think the level of individual responsibility, consciously reflecting and taking action as an individual. I think there's something else that individuals can do, and that is a careful reading and study of the concepts and principles that are in these letters to the Hague that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote is very useful, because as one thinks about them, not only do they have implications for the individual, but they have society building implications. And this is useful then to have that deeper understanding for engaging in discourse, for seeing opportunities, for collaborating and working with other people who are motivated to move ahead the peace process.
Thank you both very much for your contribution to the quest for peace through your important work and your thought-provoking and insightful book.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to be here and to be asked such good questions.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you and to have an opportunity for reflecting on the content of our book.
A World Without War, Abdu'l-Bahá and the Discourse for Global Peace by Hoda Mahmoudi and Janet A. Khan. It's available on Bahá'íBookstore.com or wherever you get your distribution services. Subscribe or follow Baha'i Books and Authors with your chosen podcast platform. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media.